Sorry? I think we'd probably be late in the game.
I know. I was thinking about using it, but I was like, oh, you agree to it. I'm actually not using React, and I kind of hate it. I forgot how much of a pain jQuery can be with regards to state management. I'm trying to do sort of a single page application. I'm like, God damn it. Yeah, you got it. What's the best place? Like right now, I have like dialogues, like literally kind of React Rails application responding with HTML, and the React or the jQuery just shoving it in and all this. We did that for a long time. Yeah, still there. It's not the worst thing in the world to do. Like if you're not doing full-on single-page app, it's fine. It's not really a full-on. Where it gets complicated is like you have a form inside that model, like what you do. Yeah, that form inside that model. Like if you make that remote true, you can kind of, it gets complicated, right? So far it's been okay, because as long as I make the selector that all the forms are remote, such remote true, and my successes are a set of document that are based on like document not on elements. Yeah. You can load it in, those event handlers are attached as they come in, right? Yeah. Sort of works. Is there like a patch on this thing? Modals is different. I mean, Rails isn't going to do anything for you as far as modals are concerned, but off the top of my head. I think there's jQuery libraries you can get that basically do that, like shove HTML inside of a book sort of thing. Yeah, I've already got it. Yeah. Shoving inside is super true. I'm not using the foundation. Okay. Yeah. I like the defaults more than I did. Bootstrap was just polluting your HTML. It's like just writing some basic stuff. Style class all.
So are apps usually built around React or React around Rails?
Typically, the way you would have it, if you had a React application, you get a bunch of choices. You can either have it that your Rails view renders a React component, right? So you have a normal Rails app, but then you render a React component inside it, and then it sort of takes over interactivity for that one page. Or you could have your entire Rails application have one index page, right? And then that controls the entire application, and it communicates with the server whenever it needs to change anything. So your server is just purely an API, and your front end is basically one HTML page that renders kind of, it would look pretty much like this, right? Where you have React.render, and then you would have your component in here that represents your entire application, and then obviously the internals of it would get a lot more complicated, right? We're going to get into like how to communicate with the server on Thursday, but stuff like this, for example, right? You would do something like, say, make a jQuery post, right, to your server, where you say /name/change or something like that, and then you say name is e.target.value, right? And then after that, you could say like .then, so after it comes back from the server, function data, this dot set state name is data.name. So basically, this is kind of the same thing, except I'm saying I still want to set my state, but before I do that, I want to tell the server that my state changed, right? So that the next time I load it, I'm going to get that state loaded from the server. that make sense?
When you get rid of that.
Then I would get rid of this last line. Yeah. We'll like walk through that specifically on Thursday, but that's kind of the idea. React controls, like all of your communications with the server would have it inside these types of methods, right? You can get even more complicated and use things like that. Facebook also has this thing called Flux that they use, which is basically a way of handling like server communications like this. It gets really, really complicated. We're definitely not going to learn Flux as part of this, but if you had a really complicated application, you might do something. I'm going to get rid of this just because it's super confusing.
We've been using this, so we switched Redux over. It's been called active providers. It's the concept you create providers, and you have components. You literally just name your prompts, your components to properties of providers, and it doesn't hookups.
So it's like the reflex stuff that I used to have. Yeah. That's cool.
It's basically just kind of it sets all the stores up for you, so you don't have to do a lot of work. Like it's actually a really nice clean library, and easy to understand. So like
that's cool.
Actions and stuff. It's actually really nice.
Nice.
Nice amount. Not a hugely popular library.
I guess we're on time, so that was the break time. Before I go further, go for it.
Yeah.
Before I go further, I know this is a lot of stuff. I know, hopefully there's not too many brains exploding. Any questions? Anything people are finding confusing about this example so far? Might seem a little pointless at this point. Hopefully something like a to-do application, which we're going to build now, will make it a little more clear on how all of this works. But you know, this is 90% of what React is. If you can kind of get your head around the idea of state, the idea of props, and the idea of your render function, you pretty much have it. There obviously is a little bit more, but this is basically what 90% of most React apps end up looking like. Cool? Okay, so we're going to try something a bit more functional, a bit more cool. We're actually going to make a to-do application instead of just our simple hello world application. So I'm going to wipe out all this to start with, and we're going to create a brand new component. So inside here, we're going to start by naming our component. We're going to call this to-do app, and we're going to do the exact same sort of boilerplate. React create class with our little curly braces, right? And we're going to define a few methods. We're going to define a render method. And we're going to define a get initial state method. We're going to put commas in between these. This is super frustrating, by the way, that you have to put commas. I always forget it. But you do need to do that. Because you're basically, the way to think about it is I'm kind of defining a hash, right? So things in between elements on hashes, you need to have that comma in there. So these two functions, most React components will have them. Get initial state, maybe not, depending on what you're doing. Get initial state basically is when I first start up my application, what should the state of my application be, right? So for a to-do app, probably what I'm going to have in my state, like the things that are going to change inside a to-do app is I'm going to have a list of to-dos, right? So I'm going to set that up in my get initial state. I'm going to say return, and I always include these curly braces because I'm returning like an object, basically, like a hash. And I want to have one thing inside my state, and I want to call it to-dos, right? And it's going to start as an empty array, right? It's just going to start as basically nothing. And then I want to make my render function. And my render function, remember, is just going to return HTML. So I'm going to say return. And I'm just going to create a div. One thing I maybe didn't mention was you can use HTML inside your React components. The one sort of rule about it, there's a couple gotchas. Number one, it always has to sort of have an element at the root, right? I can't do things like this. So I can't do that, right? Where I have like one element and then another element following it. There has to be, if you think about, elements being inside elements, there has to be one at sort of the root. So if you ever run into that problem, the easy way to get around it is just put a div around everything, right? So that everything is wrapped inside one element. Return always has to return one element that can have more things inside it, but it has to return one element and not multiple elements, right? So I'm going to return something that's kind of like a basic structure of my to-do app. And this is, when I'm using React, this is something that I find fairly helpful, is to basically start off just writing out like sample HTML. So I'm just going to write out stuff. I'm not even going to worry about state right now. I'm just going to list off a few things, right? So this is basically what I want things to appear like, right? And I'm just going to put that as raw HTML. I have no interactivity. I have nothing else. I just want to get something started, right? And then after I define my component, I'm going to render it. So I'm going to say React.render. And I'm going to include my component to do app. And then I'm going to say document.getElement by ID. And I'm just going to change this to to-do and change it up here as well. So now we're basically just rendering out static HTML. And we want to change it to use that state. But before we do that, let's just take a look at this to make sure that it's working. Sorry. Now we have my to-do app with 3 items in there. Nothing's interactive. It's just purely static HTML. What we want to do is, number one, we want to get our React app actually using state. So rather than outputting a static list of things, we want it to list the things that are actually in our state. And number two, we want to be able to actually add to-do items to our list, right? So this stuff right here is static, and I probably want to keep it the same. This stuff right here is something that I probably want to change as I add different to-do items to my list, right? So what I'm going to do is replace all of this with JavaScript, right? So in here, rather than just outputting static HTML, I want to iterate over all the to-dos that are in my state, right? So the same way in Rails, we would say something like todos.each. We could do something in JavaScript as well, right? And the way that we would do that is we are going to say this.state.todos, because remember that's going to include all of my to-dos, right? And I'm going to call a method called map on that. And map takes a function as this argument. Kind of the same way in Ruby, when you call each, you have like a block that's passed. Map works kind of the same way. I could say function to do. So for every single to do in my list, it's going to call this function and pass the to do into that, right? And then in this function, I need to return what I want to display in that particular case. So in this case, I'm going to say return li. And I'm just going to say do and /li, right? So basically, for every to-do in my list, I want to output a list element tag. I want the actual contents of the to-do to be outputted there. And I want to just close my tag. And if I were to refresh my screen, sorry, I'll give people a second. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? What I'm doing there? Like, this is basically the JavaScript equivalent of calling .each and outputting. Cool. You know what? I'm just going to try to go like split screen here, so I'm not like interrupting people who are. Is that readable-ish? Oh, here, I can do fancy Mac stuff.
Oh, they changed that.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So they used to do it, but they do that zoom out, select zoom out.
Yeah. I'm also going to change my tab width to 2 so that you can fit a little bit more. So now if I refresh this, I now have a blank list of things in my to-do app because I don't actually have any to-dos. So before we get into interactivity, let's just actually modify our initial state, the stuff that our application starts off with, to include a couple to-do items. So I'm going to say in here, mow the lawn, pick up laundry. So I'm just giving it an initial set of things. And then if I refresh this, you'll see that I'm actually getting both of those outputted to the screen for me. So now we've made this little to-do app. We have it iterating over our state, right? So it's basically outputting what a to-do list should look like given a list of to-do items, right? The next thing we want to do is add the ability to add a to-do item to that list, right? So I'm just going to create sort of standard HTML in here. I'm not going to input type equals text. And I'm going to have an input type. Or I'm actually going to have a button tag. And I'm going to say onClick equals this.add_to-do. So basically, I have a text for the to-do I want to add. And I have a button attached to that as well, right? So far, I've just set up static stuff. I'm actually going to get rid of this onClick, just so I can show you what this looks like without any sort of interactivity. Doesn't close. You have to include this little slashy thing after, which is the way of saying like a self-closing tag, right? It's an HTML thing. It's not required by HTML, but it is required by JSX. This is something you can include in HTML as well, by the way. It's just not required these days. What have I done wrong? Sorry? Line 20, but that matches up to. Sorry, I'm just going to figure out what I did wrong because it's not, something isn't lining up right now. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. I don't know. I'm just curious. Sorry?
I don't think when that happens, we're just like, oh, okay, it's not going to work.
So basically what we want to happen is I'm going to type something in here. When I click on add, I want that to actually add something to my state for all the to-dos that I have, right? So basically I'm going to attach an onClick to this button. So I'm going to say onClick is add to-do, this.add to-do. And then I can define that function. So I'm basically saying call this function whenever we add a to-do item. And again, because this is an event, it's going to get this E parameter that contains information about our event. So now we have a little bit of a problem, right? This add to is going to include information about our event. And last time we kind of used the fact that we could use e.target to actually get information about what was entered. But we have a bit of an issue now because we say e.target. The thing that's actually being clicked on isn't the text box. It is the button, right? So we need to get the value that is inside the text box rather than what's inside the button. And the way that we can do that is using something called refs. I'm making this up as I go. I'm not making it up, but I wasn't prepared exactly for this. But how do you do refs again? Yeah. Then I could say,
It's a dash.
right?
You can't put dash into the
All right, I'm just making sure I get the syntax for this right. And then I'll explain what I'm doing. But, what do I do with this? It's been a while since I've done this. Get done though.
Wait, oh, that's right, you're 13.
Yeah. Okay, so whenever you need to reference something in your component that you can't handle with an event, you have this thing called this.refs. You don't want to do something like try to use a jQuery selector in here because you might have two different versions of your to-do app on the page. And if you tried to use a jQuery selector, it's possible that it will like try to grab the wrong one. So React gives you a way to refer to different elements. And the way that it does that is called ref. So any element, whether it's a div or a UL or an LI or anything else, you can put this ref on here, and it's basically a way of telling React, I need to like refer to this element inside an event handler somewhere. So I want you to give me a really easy way to do that. And the way that you do that is using this thing called this.refs. So if I say this.refs.anything else, basically what it's going to do is it will give back information about this particular element. And then I need to call one other function called getDomNode, which is basically going to return me the actual element. So the same thing that would have been in e.target, getDomNode will return that. So I can call value on that. So now I can say this.setState, and I want to set my to-dos. And basically what I'm going to do is I want to add a new to-do, right? So I want to take the to-dos that I already had. So I'm going to say this.state.todos. And I want to put a new element on there, right? Actually,
push it off to do, right?
so I'm going to say, yeah. I'm going to call a method on the array called concat. And concat is concatenate, which basically means add a new element to this array and return it, right? So if I say an array with 1 and 2, and I say concat 3, I get 1, 2, 3 back. So I'm basically saying, take the to-dos that you had before and add 1 to it, and set my to-dos equal to that state. So I'm changing my to-dos to include a new element. And I'm just going to say text.value, because text is the actual input that I had, and the value is what I want to input there. So now, when I refresh this and I add stuff, it's actually going to add that element to my list, right? So the refs is a way of referring to those elements, and this is kind of like a bit of a preview of like the cool part about React. I don't have to manipulate this UL. I can basically just change my state from anywhere in my application, and it will figure out how it's supposed to render that list of to-dos for me, right? So you don't get into all these different things about like changing values and like manipulating classes and all that stuff that jQuery gives you. You could just describe, as long as your render method just kind of says, given the state of my application and the prompts that are passed in, this is what my application should look like. React will be able to handle that for you, and it will basically make things look nice and work really well. Yeah. Like the render?
Yeah, for some reason mine is
Let me show you like some other cool thing that we can do, like something that maybe shows a bit of the power of React. I'm going to add a div here
This includes the count of to-dos. And I'm just going to put in here, you have this dot state to-dos dot length to-dos, right? Basically, all I'm doing here is I'm adding this bit of functionality. I just want to show the number of to-dos that I have. If we were using jQuery, we would have had to actually, in this event handler right here, we would have had to add code to that to basically say when the new to-do is added, make sure you update this list, but also make sure you update this count thing. Now we can just add that to the render method, and as we add to-do items, it will automatically update that count for us, right? So it makes this like really simple flow, where we can basically just like add whatever we want in here, and as long as we're modifying state or modifying props, React will figure out how our application should render and should change based on that. Does that make sense? Let me show you one other thing, and then we'll kind of call it for a day, and we'll talk about how React integrates with Rails. We'll give you guys some homework on Slack to actually get stuff set up. Then we can talk about Rails integration for Thursday. But you know, one nice thing about React is you don't have to keep things in one giant component, right? This is already getting a bit on the large side, right? As you get more and more complicated applications, you know, you're going to have these huge components that do a million things. That's not something you typically want to do with React. And React is really nice. You can kind of create these subcomponents. And the way that I do it is exactly the same way that I would make a normal component. So let's say that we wanted to have a component that represents an individual to-do item, right? So I'm going to create a new component here, and I'm going to say var to-do equals react.createClass. Exact same boilerplate as before. And then I'm going to define a render method for that. And inside that render method, I'm just going to basically take all the stuff about an individual to-do item and do that, right? So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to paste it up here. And instead of saying to-do here, I'm going to take this .props .to-do. So basically, this to-do item is now going to expect an attribute of a to-do to render itself in. And you could imagine if we had a bunch of functionality like completing to-dos or something like that, we would have that inside this class. And then I can replace this with basically return to-do equals to-do. That's a lot of to-dos. And then I basically get the same thing, but now I've kind of like organized things a little bit better.
Where this would be relevant is, let's say I was able to complete to-dos, which would be a reasonable thing to do. I can keep functionality on how I complete a particular to-do in this particular component. And the to-do app can just deal with like managing my list of to-dos. So I can kind of like encapsulate different functionality inside different areas, right? Any questions so far? Props or state or putting things in different components, or why are we doing this? Makes sense? Seem vaguely useful? Maybe not? Okay. Do you guys want me, we have a couple options. We can totally do just like final project time if you want, or we can get into like completing a to-do and kind of like finish this off as an application. Here, let's do Slack code. Okay, people want to do it. Okay, so now let's talk about actually completing to-do items, and then this will be a good starting point because we can actually start with this to-do app, and we'll just kind of like paste it into our Rails application so that you guys can see how this works, like communicating with the server. But for now, this is nice because where did my thing go?
Oh, right, it's this thing. Okay. So now we're able to add to-dos to our list, but we can't complete to-dos. So it's a pretty shitty to-do application. So we want to add the ability to actually complete a to-do in here. And we have this subcomponent, which is nice because we can kind of isolate completing a to-do into this particular thing. So the first thing we need to do, if you guys remember way back when we did our to-do application in Sinatra, we had basically the exact same structure, where we had a list of to-dos that was just an array of strings, and then we were just outputting them to the screen. Once we add the ability to complete a to-do can't just be a string anymore, because now there's two pieces of information that are relevant to being a to-do. There's the actual thing you need to do, and whether that thing is complete or not, right? A string can't convey that. You need to have those two pieces of information. So we need to make our to-do structure a little bit more complicated. Instead of just passing strings, we now want to pass kind of objects for each of our to-dos, right? So we're going to pass hashes for each of our to-dos. So each of those is going to have a name. And let's just do that first. We're going to keep things simple and just modify it so that we have a slightly more complicated structure for our to-dos, because we know we're going to need it for when it's completed, right? So first of all, we modified our getInitialState. The second thing we need to modify is our render, so that it's now going to render out, before we were just saying render the entire to-do, now we want to render specifically the name, right? Because we have a more complicated structure, we need to actually specify that, because if we just said output the to-do, it would output this entire hash, which isn't what we want, right? And the last thing we need to do is, down in our event handler, we have this right here, where we're setting the state, and we're adding to our to-do list just the direct value of the text box. We have to like honor that structure in here as well. So we want to say in here, name is text.value, right? And just to keep things organized, I'm actually going to put this into a variable. So I'm just going to say var new to-do equals name text.value. And then I'm just going to concat new to-do in here, right? Any questions so far? So far we've just like introduced a bit more structure, and now we want to introduce the idea of completing things. So let's introduce that. In our getInitialState, we're going to add completed is false. Name is level 1. Let's make this one true. So we'll start with one already completed, just so we can show what that looks like. And name is pick up laundry. And then we're going to do the same thing in here where we're setting our new to-do. We're going to say completed is false, because if I add a new to-do, it shouldn't be completed. And my name is still going to be text.value. Now we've introduced that new structure. If I refresh, everything should still look the same. We actually need to give it some UI to actually represent, to take into account that new piece of information. So I'm going to do it as a checkbox, which is probably a reasonable thing to do with a to-do app. So I'm just going to make an input type is checkbox. And I'm basically going to say checked is equal to, anyone guess what I want to put in here? What? Oh yeah, I mean like styling wise I could do that. But if I want this checkbox to be checked if a to-do is completed, well, but I want it to be, remember, I'm getting a to-do object passed into this particular component, right? So the way that I'm able to get the text of the to-do is by saying this.props, which is the stuff that's being passed in, to-do.name, right? If I wanted to show whether it's completed or not, what would I put here? How would I just get information on the to-do that was passed in? So I would start with this.props, which is information that's being passed into my component. To-do.completed, exactly. So now I'm adding a checkbox, and I'm basically saying, if a to-do is completed, I want this checkbox to be checked. And if we refresh, we can see that the one that we've already marked completed is showing as completed, right? The next thing we need to do is we want to make it so that if I check that checkbox, if I click it basically, or if I change it, I want to mark the to-do as completed if it's not completed, or I want to mark it as incomplete if it already is completed, right? So anytime I need to do that, anytime I need to add interactivity, I'm going to add an event handler. So this is basically the same thing as we did with the text box. I'm going to say onChange, and I'm going to call this dot toggle completed. And then I'm going to put toggle completed here. So now we have, we're rendering out whether something's completed or not, and we're calling this function whenever something's completed. So basically what we need to do here is we need to modify that to-do to set it to completed if it's not completed, or set it to not completed if it is completed, right? We do have a bit of a problem. So we can get whether the input is checked by basically using, remember, we're getting E every time we have an event. We can always say e.target, and we can call any HTML attribute on that thing. So I could call e.target.checked. And that's going to be true if I just check the checkbox, and it's going to be false if I didn't check the checkbox, right? But one of the problems is, if I call this.setState, that's not going to work, right? Because I'm using this.props, which are things that can't change, right? Remember, props are things that are being passed to my component, and I can't change them. State is stuff that my component directly controls. So think of state as one component is always going to own state. It's always going to be the thing that's in control of the state. And this to-do app is already in control of the state of all of my to-dos. So I'm not allowed to change the state of my to-do app from my to-do component, right? This is probably the most complicated thing I'm going to talk about today. I can't just change this to this.state.to-do.name. And the reason I can't do that is because that would basically disconnect it from the state down here, right? Right now, every time a to-do changes, my to-do app is re-rendering all of my to-dos and passing them through. If I start using this.state here, and even if I did that getInitialState where I'm kind of setting it to the props, basically what would end up happening is every time I added a new to-do item, it wouldn't kind of get reflected here, right? I've kind of introduced this inconsistency where I want to be using this.props. If I don't own that state, and the thing that owns the state of all my to-do items is my to-do app, I need to be using this.props, right? So generally, the way that we would handle this is you want to call a method on my to-do app component. So I'm going to call back up to my to-do app component to basically say, hey, something changed. You might want to deal with this, right? So basically what we want to do is we want to pass a method in as one of the props from our to-do app down to our to-do. And then we're going to call it here. So we're going to say something like this.to-do.onChange. Or on change be a good one to use? Yeah. And I'm going to pass two methods in here. I'm going to pass the to-do, and I'm going to pass whether it's completed, e.target.check. So basically, what I'm doing now is I'm inventing my own little event handler. And what I can do in here is inside when I'm rendering out this to-do, I can attach this onChange is this.doChange. This is kind of a weird concept. But basically, the idea is the same way that I can have a div and define my own onClick event. Inside your React components, you can kind of create your own event handlers, right? I could also call this like on completed changed. I can name it whatever I want. Basically, whenever this checkbox is being changed, it's going to call something on my parent component, right? And then in my parent component, I'm allowed to modify my state. So in here, I can say on completed changed function, and it's going to take the same stuff that I passed. So in here, I was passing the to, right? And I was passing whether it was checked. So to do and is completed. Then in here, I am allowed to change my state. So here I could say this dot set state. Right. Sorry, one thing I need to figure out is I need a way. So I'm getting the to do in here, and I need to find that to do inside my array, right? So I'm going to retrieve my to do. I mean, actually, what I could do in this case is I can actually just say, sorry, I caught myself in a question. Paul, any ideas?
Sorry.
I just need a way to refer to find that to do in here.
Just have a list. You need to call a function with like an ID or something.
Yeah, I need a way of identifying. The reason I'm kind of confused right now is I need a way to sort of identify my to-do. In the Rails example, they'd actually have IDs.
You have an index.
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is when I'm rendering my to-do, I'm actually going to pass down an index to it. Does not take an index as a second argument. I'm going through a lot of stuff, and I feel really bad about this. But basically the map, the same way we could say each with index, I can pass, I'm going to get an index as the second argument to this. So I need a way of identifying this particular to-do, and I'm going to use its position in the array as a way of referring to that to-do, right? So I'm going to set a new property when I'm rendering out my to-do. I'm going to call it key. And key is actually something, whenever you're rendering a list of something, you should probably use anyway. It's a way that, it's something that React will actually look for to uniquely identify this particular to-do. So I'm saying basically the key, or the ID of this to-do, is the index that it appears in the array. So this would have a key of 0. This would have a key of 1. Any new ones I had would have keys of 2, 3, 4, et cetera, et cetera. And then what I'm going to do here is, sorry, this should be this.props. I'm going to call my onCompleted_changed, which is being passed in to the to-do, and I'm going to pass the index. So I'm going to say this.props.key, right? And e.target.checked. And then now in here, I can say this.state to-dos, and now this is an index. Completed is equal to is completed. There's a lot of stuff going on here, and I'll definitely try to take this step by step for you guys. And then this.set state, and I'm just going to set it again to the this.state.todos. What would I do in this case? Okay, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say var todos equals this.state.todos. I'm going to say todos index.completed is equal to is completed. And then reset my to-dos to my modified array. Now when I check this off, oh, this should be changed. Sorry, this is like, I find, sorry, 1 second. I obviously have something off.
I get mine from this.
Oh, yeah, it is. Okay, I'm sorry, this is introducing way more things that I wanted to deal with, but okay, I'll explain what I'm doing in a second. Okay, I'm going to have to figure this out.
The index is being faster. Just so you have ID in the thing to do that.
I think key gets mapped out and you can access key.
Right?
I don't think you can access key. I think key.
No, it's not key is the problem, it's the I. I'm using the HTML map.
Yeah. No, JavaScript map gives you a second argument. But I think the problem is the same completed the line because you're trying to access.
It's hard to try to put index on that if you really want to.
Yeah, but you.
No, that does work.
No, that works. That's not a problem. I was thinking about that. I wasn't actually.
Sorry, my apologies. I just got kind of messed up there. So let me walk through what I'm doing. This is a heady concept and it's hard to get your head around. But basically what we're doing is, at the end of the day, you have one thing that owns the state of to-do items, right? And that is our to-do application. So to-do application is completely responsible for the state of all of our to-dos, right? We also have this subcomponent called to-do, right? To-do is responsible for a particular to-do item, right? So that introduces a problem because since to-do app owns the state, and you can only change state, and you can never change props, and you can only change state in the actual component that owns that state, we need a way for our to-do to let the to-do app know, I want you to change something about one of my particular to-do items. And the way that you do that in React, and it's always kind of a pain to get it right, and this is kind of the most complicated part about React, so once you have this down, you have React kind of down, is you need to provide, like, think of it like a hook, right? To-do isn't able to modify its to-dos, to-do app is. So to-do is going to provide functionality to basically say, hey, if you want me to notify you when someone changes something about when a to-do app is completed, you can pass a function to me. This is the same thing as doing on-click or on-change, except you're kind of creating your own custom event handler, right? So if you had, say, a log application, you could have an event handler that basically said, when someone posts a new comment, I want you to call this method. You can kind of create your own custom events, and that's what we're doing here. So we're basically saying, anytime something changes about whether a to-do is completed or not, I want you to call the to-do changed method on the to-do app, right? And basically what that's doing is it's taking my state of to-dos, which is something that I can change. It's finding a to-do by the index and setting its completed to whatever the to-do app is telling me is the completed state. And then it's modifying the state of the to-dos. So that's going to re-render everything. It's going to re-render this to-do, right? And then in the to-do app, all I need to do is, in that custom event handler, I'm basically saying, when this checkbox is checked, I want you to call the method that was passed in, right? So you're passing a method down, and then this is just like recalling it. What I'm passing through to it is completely arbitrary. You can kind of pass whatever you want. In this case, I need two pieces of information to modify my state. I need the index of the to-do, which is something I'm passing down as well. I'm just passing, okay, every time I render a to-do, I'm going to set an ID property equal to the index, and then whether the actual element was checked, right? So by doing that, now I'm able to complete to-dos and not complete to-dos and incomplete to-dos and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, and even when I add new ones, that works fine. This can seem complicated for sure, and it's super confusing to kind of get your head around, but once you get that, you can kind of get the coolness of React. Because in a complicated application, something like this little checkbox here on the to-do thing could be nested in like components that are super, super deep, right? And then what you can do is basically, I want to notify that something changed up to the thing that actually holds my state, and then my entire application will re-render itself. So I don't have to worry about what happens when a particular to-do item is changed. My main application can handle that, and it can kind of say, this is what should happen when a to-do item is changed. Or maybe not even. It just basically needs to say, based on the state of my application, this is what it should look like. And then all I have to do is modify that state, and then my app will just re-render itself so that it reflects like all the changes that I'm making. I find this confusing. This took me weeks to get my head around. If you find this confusing, don't worry. We'll dig into it again on Thursday. But that's kind of like the most complicated thing about React in my mind. And when you hear about things like Flux, it's actually trying to solve a bit of this problem because it can turn into a mess. Any questions? Was that brain exploding?
This and that.
Oh, sorry. This is a pain in the ass. Yeah, this is another thing. I did this without really talking about it. This in JavaScript is kind of like self in Ruby, but not really. Anytime I call something like map, right, this is going to be changed. So anytime I have a function inside another function, this is going to change into something else. So this is a common trick that you'll see in JavaScript. Basically what it's doing is saying, I know that this is what I want to use down here, but this is going to change by the time I get down here. So I'm going to put it in a variable so I can use it here. If you ever have problems with this, it's always because you're doing something inside a function usually. And whenever you see that, a good way of handling it is just saying var that equals this. Which is kind of like, you'll see this all over JavaScript code. People kind of know what you're doing when you do this. I could also say something like var component equals this, and then this could be like component. Or I could even say var to-do app equals this, and then I'd say to-do app. It's basically just guarding against the fact that this is going to change when I call that it's inside my render, right? The other thing you could do, actually probably even better way to do this. Sorry? That's not less confusing. Yeah, this is a really confusing concept in JavaScript. Is this? But the other thing I could do is just actually have to do change up here and say this dot to do change, which is also totally appropriate. I'm just putting it in a variable up here, and then I can just use that variable down here. Right? And that works exactly the same. And if I say stuff. Sorry, I can't hear you. Oh, yeah. So to do change, again, it's just getting my state, putting it in a variable. I'm going to find it by index. So index is the thing that I'm passing in for the ID. If you're doing this realistically, you would probably have like an actual ID property if it's coming from Rails or something. And we'll definitely talk about that when we make this like Railsified. But in this case, I'm just using its position in the array as the ID. And then I'm passing this piece of information. So all this thing needs to do is basically set something to completed and reset the state to the to-dos.
So right now it's just kind of not really saving anything, it's just kind of having it.
Yes. So we haven't talked about Rails integration, and we're going to talk about that on Thursday. Let me talk about one thing that we could do a little bit of saving, I guess you could say. And we can use something called local storage, which is basically something that exists in the browser, and it's a way of saving things to like the local person's hard drive. It can be useful, but obviously if you go to a different computer, you're going to get a completely different set of things. But for a toy example, it's something that we can definitely try. Can I put that in like an on-state change or something like that? Yeah. So there's one other method that you can call in React called
It's the same thing that does props changes. When it will receive props.
component will update is better. Sorry? Actually, you know what? Let's do a simpler way of doing this rather than using the callbacks. So basically what we want to do is we want to save the value of all of our to-dos to local storage whenever our state changes for some reason. So we're going to add our own method in here, which is basically, we're just going to call it change state. Sorry, change state. We're going to say function new state. And you can always use this thing called window.localStorage, right? And it works kind of like a hash. So I could say, I haven't used this in a while, but I'm pretty sure this is how it works. So I'm going to say window.localStorage to-dos. Let me open this thing. Oh, set item. Okay, we'll talk about it on Thursday. It's more complicated to use local storage. Basically, you have this local storage thing, but it can only store strings, which introduces a whole new set of concepts we need to deal with. We're going to talk about how to actually make this persist on the server and not just be something that lives for, you know, until you refresh your page on Thursday. What's that? Yeah, I'll update the gist. I'm just going to add a file to it, I think. I think that's the thing I can do, right? Maybe not. I'll make a new gist. That's it. Put that in Slack. Brain sufficiently broken for today? Or is there anything else people, any other questions on this stuff? Says the person who uses React daily. So yeah, there's a lot here. That kind of talking up to parent components definitely gets a little bit crazy. It's something you just kind of have to get used to a little bit. But we'll drill into it a little bit more tomorrow. I mean, yeah, I can't think of an easier way to describe it other than the main thing to remember when you're thinking about React is there's always going to be one thing that owns the state. And probably for most React applications, you're always going to have this pattern of you have one component at the very, very top of your application that owns all of the state. And then everything below it is going to use this sort of callback to say, change your state. That seems awkward and it seems really tricky, but it's half the power of React because it lets you create all these like really small components that just get information passed to them. You don't have to worry about like tweaking how each one of them works. You could just modify state at the top and then just say, re-render my entire application and everything just works. So it ends up allowing your application to be really well organized. Cool. I think, yeah, that's maybe enough brain breaking for today. We can do some final project stuff, or if people have other React questions or anything like that, let me know. Cool. What's